All right, moving right along with part 2. This is going to be sections 39 and 40, and also something that we were designated not to print. So we're gonna blow open the lid on this one today. And I should say not to print in Revelation book 1. There's a big old note there. So 39 and 40 are paired together. This is a revelation to a man by the name of James Covel. Excuse me. And section 40, as we now have it, is a response to section 39. And so these are very much paired together. And so, and I apologize, I could not find a tombstone for James. I could not find his picture, and you will be hearing about why very soon. But I really did try to see who this man was, because this has been a very interesting story from when I was a kid hearing this. So anyway, we're going to dive a little bit more into it. So let's get into the introduction. Starting in section 39, the earliest version that we now have is Revelation book 1. This is the 42nd commandment. This and the 43rd commandment will be paired together. And that's, I think John Whitmer was doing that on purpose when he put together the Revelation books. There are some grammatical changes and editorial changes in the document, and most of them, by the way, which I find very interesting, are actually done in the hand of Joseph Smith himself. So taking a look at the second page of this revelation, as we have it in Revelation book 1, this is the handwriting of Joseph Smith. And the story here goes that, James Covel was this minister. He had been a minister for a very long time. He gets his own revelation. He's invited to join the church. And then almost immediately, he skips town and they never hear from him again. And section 40, this is kind of the Lord explaining what happened to them, because Sidney and Joseph are like, what happened? And so I find it very interesting, considering that this was a lot more of a private and personal thing to Joseph and Sidney, that Joseph Smith's hand would be the one making these little corrections here and there on it. So just a little personal note there that I thought was interesting. So that's Revelation book 1. It is chapter 41 in the Book of Commandments, and it is section 59 in the original Doctrine and Covenants. This revelation and section 40 were also published in the Times and Seasons, which is a church periodical at the time. And so you get a couple of different, this was kind of a widely published, widely known revelation from the beginning. So getting into some of the circumstances surrounding this, Revelation book 1 gives an introduction to this, and it says, 42nd commandment, received January 5th, 1831. There was a man by the name of James, Covel, who covenanted with the Lord that he would obey any commandment that the Lord would give through his servant Joseph, and accordingly he inquired of the Lord, and he received these words as follows. And then we get the revelation. The manuscript history gives, not long after the conference closed, there was a man came to me by the name of James Covel, who had been a Baptist minister for about 40 years and covenanted with the Lord that he would obey any command that the Lord would give through me as his servant. And I received the following revelation to James Covel, given at Fayette, New York, January 5th, 1831. And then you get the revelation. So in the past, the Doctrine and Covenants, at least up until 2013, referenced that. That's where the section heading came from. And there's no real difference, by the way, in this particular section heading between 1981 and 2013. So then we go into the Joseph Smith Papers, Documents, Volume 1, Historical Introduction, says, the identity of the revelation's recipient is not known with certainty. So if you want to know why I couldn't find a tombstone or a photo, it's because we don't exactly know who he is. Two individuals living in New York at the time fit the general description, and no source definitively identifies either man as the recipient. The earliest extant manuscript copy of the revelation featured below provides only a given name. The first, printed in 1833, expanded James to James C. with no additional information. And in 1835, the name was given as James Covel in the Doctrine and Covenants. Joseph Smith's history also uses this spelling because its editors relied on the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants for the Revelation text. The history adds that Covel had been a Baptist minister for about 40 years. James Covel, a Baptist minister from Ellery, New York, who in 1831 was over 70 years old, fits this description, but he lived in the far western edge of the state, more than 150 miles away. Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon would have met Covel on their way to Ohio at the end of January, but according to this earliest copy of the Revelation, it was given, quote, at Fayette on the 5th of January, 1831. Another possibility. The recipient of the revelation was much more likely James Covel, or Covel, whatever, a Methodist elder from Canandaigua, is it Canandaigua, New York? I'm sorry about these names, guys. The index to Revelation Book 1 describes the recipient as a Methodist priest, not a Baptist. James Covel lived about 20 miles southwest of Canandaigua, New York, and had been associated with the Methodist Church for nearly 40 years. He may have heard Joseph Smith or Sidney Rigdon preaching in the Canandaigua area after Joseph Smith and several others preached with great power in Ezra Thayer's barn near Canandaigua in October 1830. They were invited to preach in Canandaigua. They had promised that we should meet in the Methodist meeting house, Thayer later wrote, but the trustees could not agree. As president of the Regional Methodist Conference, Covel was likely aware of the request. In December, a Mormon preacher, probably Joseph Smith or Rigdon, delivered a discourse in the townhouse in Canandaigua to an assembly of 200 or 300 people. Covel may have attended the December meeting and then traveled to Fayette, where the revelation was dictated. So those are your possibilities for who this James is. So what's the aftermath of this? Well, the aftermath of this revelation, which is admonishing him to, sort of start preaching and be a minister of the gospel and all this, is section 40, which we'll get to in a moment. But I thought this was interesting as a footnote inside of section 39. It says, within a day after Joseph Smith dictated this revelation, Covel departed from Fayette without explanation, leaving Joseph Smith and Rigdon to wonder why he did not follow the commandment. A revelation on the 6th of January explained, quote, why he obeyed not the word. And the following revelation, which was section 40, was given. And I think that might just be the best segue of all time in this little series that we have. So let's talk about section 40, which is far shorter than section 39. Earliest version that we have is still in Revelation Book 1. This is the 43rd commandment. Again, they're even paired way back then from the very beginning. A few changes, mostly additions, and a couple of verse numbers are added by William W. Phelps. It is chapter 42 in the Book of Commandments and section 60 in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. The section heading is actually different. Look out, between 2013 and 1981, because instead of just saying January of 1831, it says January 6th. So if you're reading along in your scriptures, you've got section 39 is on the 5th of January, section 40 is on the 6th, and section 40 is like, yeah, he bailed and I will do with him as I please. He's kind of left this out. He's been influenced by some, I guess, negative influences, and away he goes. So that's it. We don't get anything from these two sections in Histories Volume 2. So the John Whitmer history that we've been reading from doesn't exist, and neither do any of the others. But this one was, as I said before, with section 39, was published in the church periodical, The Times and Seasons. And so this has been published in every scripture, every church newspaper from the start. So these two were definitely together the whole time. Circumstantially to this, what we get out of Revelation Book 1 is 43rd Commandment, January 6th, 1831. A revelation to Joseph and Sidney Rigdon received at Fayette, Seneca County, state of New York, telling them why James Covel received not the obeyed not the command, which he received, etc. Manuscript history gives us this. As James Covel rejected the word of the Lord and returned to his former principles and people, the Lord gave unto me and Sidney Rigdon the following revelation explaining why he obeyed not the word, given at Fayette, New York, January 6, 1831. So Joseph later, and again, the manuscript history, you're talking about 1838 and beyond. So we're still 7, maybe 8 years ahead, and he's kind of looking back and filled that history in. Thank you, Joseph Smith. Historical introduction of Documents Volume 1, so coming back to our beloved papers of Joseph Smith, says, by 6th of January, 1831, the day after a revelation called him to preach the gospel, Methodist minister James Covel had departed Fayette, New York, leaving Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon searching for an explanation. As Joseph Smith later recalled, after Covel rejected the word of the Lord and returned to his former principles and people, the Lord gave Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon this 6th of January, 1831 revelation, quote, explaining why he obeyed not the Lord. So kind of a, I don't know, maybe a summation of what I've already just read to you from that. All right, then we get into our final section of this part, and I won't be getting into it too much like I normally would for reasons that you will suddenly understand. But there is something here, and as you can see, it is just called explanation. This is not a commandment. This says explanation on it. I mean, it is a commandment, but it's got this big thing on it. And very fancy letters. Thank you, John. It is the last document that we have from 1830, and it's a very, very important one for the church. And again, it was placed here in this particular case, which is why in the chronology, that's where they put it in the Joseph Smith papers. So Revelation Book 1 shows this as the 41st commandment, followed by an explanation, in very big fancy words, of the first epistle to the 1 Corinthians 7th chapter and 14th verse, given to Joseph the seer at Wayne County, New York, 1830. Accompanied by this, you can see, not to be printed. So therefore, this section was not printed in the Book of Commandments, nor in the Doctrine and Covenants, nor anywhere else in Joseph Smith's lifetime. However, I'm not going to get into it too much because you now know it today as Doctrine and Covenants, section 74. So this one was not lost. It just was not published at the time. So for a long time, it was thought that this came in 1832. But based on the location and where Joseph was at the time, it was likely at the end of 1830. So there's some debate there, and that's why, even though I say it's one of the last things from 1830, anyway, that we're just kind of going with the documentation that we have from the paper series. So that's why we're doing it here at the end. The content of the explanation was really just an interpretation of a singular verse. It was 1 Corinthians 7:14. Look it up if you like, but apparently, and I did not know this actually when I first started researching this, infant baptism was actually kind of debated at the time of Joseph Smith. So he wasn't really the only one speaking out about it. So if you're not familiar with maybe some Christian beliefs, it is this idea, and it is justified in this scripture that when children are born, they need to be baptized right away. So that's why, hence infant baptism. And I believe, and I could very well be mistaken, I don't know all things, but most of the time, babies are sprinkled with water instead of immersed completely for probably obvious reasons. And they are baptized, and usually at least in the Catholic Church, I know that is being christened. And that's when you become a Catholic. And so there's beautiful ceremonies surrounding that. But there was some debate about whether or not that should happen. And so footnote 1 from this section gives this. And again, I'm going to go a lot more into this once section 74 is the episode. So I'm just not going to do it for the sake of time today, and also because we need content for the future. But footnote 1 from this section says, according to one modern theologian, quote, with the exception of the scripture passage where Jesus blesses little children, no passage has been laid under a more laborious contribution to serve the cause of infant baptism than this one, unquote. The topic of infant baptism was also prevalent in Christian debates during Joseph Smith's time. Joseph Smith had earlier clarified a biblical passage regarding John the Beloved. So this is going to be discussed further as I'm skipping the detail for now. But if you're not completely familiar, from the Book of Mormon, there's a very harsh criticism against infant baptism left by Mormon in the latter part of the Book of Mormon. And I believe that was actually printed in the subsection called the Book of Mormon. And I think a portion of that is even in the Book of Moroni. A lot of that's where it comes from. I think some of it comes from the debate of the time. I am not aware of anything inside of the book of Moses that talks about this, and so this Bible translation that was going on at the same time, I don't believe. I mean, what do I know? But I don't believe had to do with why this revelation was given. But this is something that actually happens from henceforth. There's a couple of scriptures that Joseph asks the Lord about and receives a revelation to explain what it is. And so, again, this was never published during his lifetime, but it was in section 74. So, not to be printed was eventually printed. So, sorry if I oversold the bit, but that's part of my job here at the Amateur Historian Society, of which I'm the only member. Anyway, but yeah, there you go. So that's our episode for today. I hope you've enjoyed that. We got, I think, 4 sections out of it, plus one that apparently you weren't supposed to see until later. So until next time, apologize for my new look. I had a thing happen. I won't get into all of that, but appreciate you sticking with me on this. And hopefully we'll see you next week on Filling in the History. Have a good week.